Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Clint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Christina Haxton, founder of the Center for Sustainable Strategies. Christina works with CEOs and executive teams navigating growth, leadership transition, and organizational complexity, including in PE-backed environments where leadership teams have to turn strategy into execution without burning out the people doing the work. Christina and I met during the People Synergy Summit. She offered up sharp insights in the chat, and one line really stuck with me. Unresolved people problems become profit problems. What makes Christina's perspective unique is that before she moved into executive coaching and leadership advisory, she was a marriage and family therapist. That gives her a different lens on what happens when two organizations come together. Today, we'll talk about why leadership alignment is really an execution issue, how unresolved people problems show up in the numbers, and what leaders can do to rebuild ownership, clarity, and trust after close. Christina, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Glenn. I sure appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I've been excited for this conversation for a bit. So you have a really fascinating background. So before you moved into executive coaching and leadership advisory work, you were a marriage and family therapist. So I'd love to hear how that path led you into the kind of work you're now doing with companies going through growth and integration.
Absolutely. Well, as a marriage and family therapist, I worked with a lot of individuals as well. And I'd say probably and this was in about 2008. You remember 2008?
I do.
I was working with a lot of executives who were maybe former CEOs. They were former because they took an early retirement, forced or voluntary. They were burned out from their previous role. And it was funny because it wasn't necessarily, and these CEOs, there were, I'd say 99% men, probably, in their 50s, 60s ish. And they didn't self-refer. They were referred by their wives with an ultimatum. Like,
Okay.
you go see Christina or else. And the reason I think I was recommended, I found out later, was because I had a client who named my approach the KITA approach. And KITA stands for, it's spelled KITA, he says, and it stands for kick in the ass. Can I say that? If not, edit it out. And so that's kind of what I became known for, kind of a no nonsense, no BS, get your stuff together, and be careful. I got to watch my language. Get your stuff together. What comes up comes out. So there may be a lot of editing. I don't know. And so I noticed with a lot of the clients, I say a lot, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 stand out to me. They wanted to recover from burnout. They were CEOs, COO of some Fortune 50. Some were Fortune 500, and 2 were Fortune 50 organizations in 2008. Then after, with therapy is like, I feel bad. I want to feel back to my normal, right?
Mhm.
And coaching is, I feel good. I want to feel much better. Right. So difference between therapy and coaching. But my therapy approach was solution focused and strength based. So, it really leaned more toward, I want to do better and get to a better level of functioning that I was at. So I had two specific CEOs who, once they recovered, I was ready. I got fired as a therapist. That was always my goal, is to be fired. Fired me as a therapist, contacted me, maybe 6 months or so down the road and said, hey, really found a lot of value from therapy and learned a lot about myself and learned a lot about others and how to get along with my kids or get along with my spouse. And I want to go into business for myself. I want to start my own company.
Mhm.
Did you know that just because you've been the CEO or COO of a Fortune 50 or Fortune 500 organization does not make you a great entrepreneur?
Right.
Like,
Very different skills.
Very different skills. So, on or about that time, I was also actively, operating as an executive coach. So transition from therapist to executive coach. And then I also realized, and I need one of those assessments, those personality assessments that you can do. If there's strategy involved, like what are your strengths? Strategy is always up there on the tops. I'm fascinated by how to get people to work better together to get stuff done. Again, I it's not really what I call it, but we'll call it get stuff done. And so I then broadened. I was actually brought in to work with a former executive coaching client and his business partner. He was a serial entrepreneur, self-proclaimed serial entrepreneur, because what would happen is he would get to a certain part of growth in the company, and he was a visionary, so he always saw things differently than the operating person. In this case, the other partner was the operations guy, and he would just tap out and go. Like,
Yeah.
he would sell his shares or sell his ownership, and he would go start something else. And so he wanted to change that. So he actually brought me in to work with his team, i.e. his partner, and then from there to help them get along and get stuff done, appreciate each other's strengths so that he didn't have to tap out. He could stay involved and work through the conflict, which we did. And then from there, they brought me in to do a strategic planning session with their entire company, which was pretty small. I don't know, maybe 12, all men engineers, except for one woman, which was actually his wife, involved in the process. And so we did a real deep dive into, basically, I called it an inclusive, at the time, inclusive strategic planning process that was executed by all or owned by all. So that's also where I developed the concept of ownership versus accountability. And then I stayed on and worked with them to develop kind of what is the operation, how do you operationalize this plan? And so stayed on with them for, I don't know, maybe another 6 months or so. And then 18 months later, they got bought by Google. And that was another story. It wasn't necessarily intentional, but he says that as a result of our work together, building out the strategic plan and operationalizing it, everybody being able to take ownership of it, got the attention of Google, and they sold.
I mean, that's a definite win, building from something where I'm going to use the word dysfunctional, recognizing that there's probably some clinical implications that don't apply here,
Yeah.
given your background, but a team that maybe isn't functioning as well as it could, needing a little bit of extra support, to now they're being purchased by one of the biggest companies out there. I mean, that's a success story, Christina.
Their process was what got the attention of Google, and they couldn't have developed the process had they been stuck in the founder's idea of, "This is my baby, nothing can change." So we had to expand. It wasn't an either or, because at first it was an either or between the partners. It became a both and we actually created, again, small company, big in revenue numbers, but it was a SaaS company, and they figured out a process that got developed by the people as a result of that strategic plan, and that's what Google invested in. And fortunately, my client did end up having to stick with Google, which was his worst nightmare, for a couple of years, as you know, in the buyout agreement. And unfortunately, the sad ending, and as you know, and may or may not know, with most acquisitions, the sad ending is it doesn't go well. Everything they built got torn apart. The people got, scattered all over four corners. It kind of broke my heart when I heard that. I didn't know that this had happened until after it happened. So I think, I don't know, if Google had been a customer, we might have been able to prevent that, but maybe not. I mean, they just bought the process.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, having seen a number of M&As in my career, sometimes that's the goal. We could probably go down a whole bunny trail of talking about what happens during post-merger integration when large companies buy small ones, and it can be really tricky when things get torn apart like that, and can be really heartbreaking. At
Yeah.
the same time, if the buyer got the value that they paid for,
Yep.
that's sometimes the name of the game.
They may be using that technology to this day, and without revealing anyone or any organization, you use it every day on your phone. Every day,
Well,
every day, every
yeah,
minute.
yeah, and that's the benefit there. So it sounds like they probably got their value, but sometimes the human side of the story can be,
Yeah,
it can be the hard part of it.
it
So,
does.
well, let's talk a little bit more about M&A. So, Christina, you shared a bit about how you brought together those two partners inside the company. We both know that inside the merger context that you've got to get two entire leadership teams to work together. And that can be one of the hardest things that happens in any merger. So, what really has to happen to bring two entire teams together? Where do most companies get it right? And what are some of the mistakes they make when they try to do that work?
Absolutely. I think most companies try to solve a two-team problem through structure or process, right? We have a new org chart, new reporting lines, maybe a new operating cadence, and those things do matter, but they don't really address the thing that determines where the two groups of senior leaders are going to function as one. It is an integrated unit. And that is whether or not they have built enough trust to disagree,
Hmm.
because that requires trust. How they decide, who decides what, whether it's we're going to take a vote and majority wins, or we have to get consensus, or is commitment enough, right? I think they have to decide how they're going to decide each big decision
Yeah.
and not assume. Uh, and how do they move together under pressure? Because as there's pressure in that scenario. So they
Right.
have to decide, do some scenario planning. If this happens, then what? Let's decide before the pressure gets really cranked up, because everybody has different memories of it once it does, and then stick to their commitment, right? Leadership teams, each leadership teams brings together two sets of informal rules. Like I said, how decisions get made, who has status, what does leadership excellence look like, how conflict is handled, and most of that's invisible until it breaks,
Right.
right? And that's where you see collisions. So I think what has to happen first, I think you have to name what each team is bringing, right? Just name it. Don't judge it, just name it. What are their working norms? What are their strengths? And how do they behave, in a default way under stress, right? We just
Great.
have to bring it up, talk
Can you?
about it, put it out on the table.
So I love this. I'm wondering if you can share an example. I mean, obviously without naming names, but maybe you can tell us about a leadership team that maybe looked like they were aligned, but they didn't really have this level of trust and how you brought them through this process that you're sharing. I think an example would help people relate better.
Yes, absolutely. So I'd say leadership team of 7, strong CEO, very charismatic, very sharp, very smart. Wasn't the founder or owner, was the CEO, and they were hard charging. I mean, they had goals. He had goals, big, hairy, audacious goals. And he was very inspiring, kind of very coach like. Yeah, everybody's on the same page. And sometimes he was a bit far apart from what the team was experiencing. And he was very optimistic also. Fortunately, he was also coachable. And this was probably the very first meeting I had with them. So they brought me in to facilitate strategic planning to get them prepared for a private equity acquisition, not
Okay.
acquisition, but engagement that they were going to be invested in my private equity
Okay.
company. And they had a strategy, but it was sort of kind of. They had a very complicated strategy using a very complicated program. There were a zillion priorities, which often changed. And when a priority would change, the team's experience was it was oh, by the way, we're doing this instead. And oh, by the way, we've got to focus on
Mm,
this. And they never decided what are we going to say no to. So when I got brought in, it was clear to me what was going on as I can just really see the whole perspective. Where we first started with this team, and in which if you asked the CEO, so I said, so tell me about trust in the organization, like the trust that if they tell you the truth, how are you going to respond or react to that? Are you open to that information? Because how you, CEO, respond or don't respond to that information that you don't really want to hear, that doesn't align with your vision, is going to determine whether or not they continue to give you information or they withhold it. So we first looked at trust and we measured that using a tool. So we measured that. We got everybody's individual, and here's where it gets kind of like you fingers crossed. nobody gets fired. How each individual member of the leadership team, individually and collectively, why did they give it that score in terms of
Mhm.
team trust? Because that's the foundation for everything, Clint. It really, really is. We're talking about people and relationships. That's how business gets done. That's how stuff gets done. I don't care, who you are. We're human beings first. And so when we did that trust assessment, that was a wake up call for the CEO. He realized that when he was making kind of rogue decisions, oh, we're going to go do this. And like he'd talk to a vendor and he'd get excited about, some technology, and he'd come back and without conversing with them or getting their input, or what kind of impact would that have, or being open to hearing no, or why that wouldn't work, or what are we going to stop doing. So he realized that he needed to be open to some of the conversations that needed to happen, as well as his behavior in that executive team meeting. Like if if his phone rang in the meeting, he would get up, walk out, and take the call
Oh
in a
my.
leadership meeting. Yeah. And so as a facilitator, it was my responsibility to, with as much, TLC as possible, but no BS, is to basically ask him what that was about and how did he feel, how did he think that landed, especially when it came to trust, right? So that's where I started with that team, and that was a real eye opener for them. Once they were able to have those conversations and he could hear it and be thoughtful about it and recognize when his behavior was not in scope of what they agreed upon as a team. He also was taking ownership of that, and that in itself built trust. So
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So, at the beginning, you talked about the difference between holding people accountable and ownership. And
Mhm.
I hear that come up a lot when we do integrations, right? We need to hold the right people accountable for results or the right people accountable for their behavior. How is ownership different from holding people accountable, especially during these M&A processes?
So let me speak to the difference between ownership culture. I call it an ownership culture, where 100% of ideally 100% of the people take 100% ownership 100% of the time. We know that's an ideal.
Okay.
Different than an accountability culture. When you think about accountability, I don't know, the visual image I get in my head is this big thumb coming down from the clouds,
Right.
micromanaging people, people being overseen, right?
Mhm.
There is inherently in that culture, there is mistrust. And
Okay.
that's what people feel. In an ownership culture where each individual person who works at that company gets an opportunity. I mean, it starts at the top and it's got to cascade all the way down, and feedback has to come all the way back up the channel. But when people can get an opportunity of having a say in maybe how something is done, they might not get a say in why something's done or what is going to be done, but when they get a say in how they can bring their strengths to the table, how they can do their job, if there's, you know, in a highly regulatory environment, that's challenging, but usually we can find something. Like they can own the how, right? And then when they can own the impact, like what is their KPI? What is their measurable? What is their one metric that they can see that their behavior, their work, their effort makes an impact that trickles up to organizational goals. And that's a loop, right? We want to open the loop and close that loop. So I think that, and people want to take ownership. They want to have mastery, right? They want to their pride, right? That's directly related to self-esteem and certainty. Right. Uncertainty is accountability. Like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for this, or I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I hear that a lot. I don't know how my performance is being measured. Be surprised. People really don't understand. So they can be involved in that process, right? And co-create the kind of what it looks like to own your role and
Right.
what your metrics are. Wow, you get people really showing up. And when they're asked, how's it going? What's getting in your way? What's the problem you need to solve? What have you tried? In a more of a coaching approach rather than a do it my way or else, and I'm not going to tell you why. I'm giving an extreme example. I'm sure
Sure.
there's no companies out there that do that anymore. So that's what I would say the difference between ownership and accountability would be.
No,
What?
that makes sense. You pointed to something that reminds me of the episode I did with Dr. Liz Lance, where she talks about people's perceptions of self-efficacy, like I can do my job, I can do it
Yeah.
well, I make a difference, actually have a demonstrable impact on integration quality. So, we've got lots of observation, and she ran the numbers, and it shows up. So let's talk for a minute about those employees then, Christina, those folks that are customer facing, delivering that experience in an M&A context. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you move from the leadership team getting aligned to the front line then getting aligned with the broader vision of the organization.
I think, what comes to mind, and again, this is for me, and this is not, deep work I have done. A lot of this is, I've done this in microcosm. So
Yeah,
some of this is theorizing, right? But from what my experience has been, working with organizations, HR, right, is oftentimes responsible, not necessarily doesn't have the authority, but they have the responsibility, and hopefully they have the authority to really connect people, right? To their roles
yeah,
and to through whether it's, I don't know, the manager and the employee meeting and co-creating that IPP, individual performance plan and metrics, right? And making sure that people, who are customer facing have a communication channel. I mean, they're the ones, I think it was the FedEx CEO said the most important person in an organization is not the CEO, it's your customer facing
right.
employees, right? Because they experience the client satisfaction more so, and more often they experience the client dissatisfaction, right? And there may be a lack of process or a problem that they keep seeing over and over again or hearing about, and they feel maybe helpless to have, they don't have the decision rights to make it better. uh, they're looking at, well, there's, this is our process, or this is the way we've always done it, I mean, and so they kind of align with the complaining customer, just even, I don't know, at emotional level,
Yeah,
right? And then feel frustrated or stuck that they can't make an impact or a difference. So when you can really, not just through an annual survey, but really through a very intentional, consistent conversations, or a consistent communication channel, where whether it's the manager is the one to, check in and say, what are you seeing? Tell me about a problem you've solved. How did you solve it? Are there any persistent problems, right? Persistent people problems that are unresolved or expensive. Persistent people problems are actually usually process problems, or what I see as lack of process problems, right? And then get their input, get what their experience is, and see if they have any suggestions for solving it. I mean, sometimes I think that's really overlooked, which is ask the person doing the job,
yeah.
how could we do it better? What do you need? Right? So that's what I would like to see, if that would make an impact, right, for people feeling like, whether it's self-efficacy, decision rights, taking some, some ability to personally have a positive impact on making a change, and making somebody not just a, happy customer, but a loyal customer.
Yeah. In my experience, Christina, this is where I think a lot of your employee listening gets really important. So,
Yes.
a lot of organizations don't survey their people afterwards. They don't do manager skip levels or focus groups. And it's a really big missed opportunity, to your point about having those customer facing people who can tell you during the integration, hey, where's this breaking down? Where's it going well? What do I need to go take care of the customer? And a lot of acquirers don't seem to value that voice, or at least not enough to do the survey. And it's such a huge missing, and it'd be such a big unlock for organizations to just not only survey people, but actually pay attention to the answers that come back.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really frustrating thing. We get surveyed to death, and then they either A, don't see the results, right? There's no
Right.
transparency. So whenever we get brought in to do the, in our discovery process, we oftentimes do meet with a large representation, if the company's really large, large representation of everybody in the company, to do stakeholder interviews and focus groups, so that we can
Mhm.
make sure, we've got the right size. I don't want to use the word hammer. Never mind. I don't like that metaphor. But basically, we're finding, we're creating a solution for the actual problem, right? Not just the perceived problem. But oftentimes, people will be more honest and forthcoming with somebody from the outside of the
Right.
organization, because I also have experienced this quite a bit where there's this kind of inherent mistrust, that there's maybe a potential lack of confidentiality when you're reporting, a problem to somebody on the inside.
Right.
So just kind of food for thought, but yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, don't just do a survey and then tell them what you're gonna do with the information. That
Right.
happens a lot too, right? Like, this is how we're gonna act, or this is what we recognize and we're not yet ready to act on it, or we never will act on it in a million years. But they at least need to feel heard.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of research on survey fatigue out there, and
Mhm.
everything that I've seen and experienced comes back to people aren't tired of taking surveys. They're tired of taking surveys where you don't close the feedback loop.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so what I really recommend companies do is a very simple follow-up in a week of the survey closing that says, "You said X, we did Y." Or to your
Yes.
point, "You said X, we're never going to do Y in a million years, but this is what we're doing instead." Obviously
Yeah.
shape that message,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
no, that's fantastic. You mentioned HR, and having been in HR for a good chunk of my career, I know that we often have a lot of responsibility, but not necessarily a lot of authority. So I think you called that out. And I'm just really curious for the HR folks that are out there, any suggestions for working inside that dynamic, or for leaders out there, any advice about what that dynamic where maybe it's not HR, maybe it's really any function that you give a lot of responsibility without authority. What does that disconnect cost the organization in terms of alignment?
Gosh, a lot. Anytime you have responsibility without authority, I think, as a human, you feel stuck, and helpless seems like a strong word, but oftentimes it leads to that feeling which actually leads to burnout. So
Right.
talk about cost to an organization, right? So I think, from HR's perspective, and again, I've never even played one on TV, but I deeply understand their position and their responsibility, just not from a technical aspect, but just
Sure.
from, the people aspect. I think, first of all, people
Well,
at the top, the CEO, the leadership team, they must give them decision-making rights, and we talk about a seat at the table. In fact, I think it was a roundtable I listened to, maybe it was last week or so, and it had been a while since I did really even heard any HR kind of conversations, but it's still there. It's getting better, but it's still there, this whole, "We need a seat at the table." What does that mean, right? Or what does that mean if HR has an initiative, but they're just like, "Oh, I don't know if we're gonna get this funded," because it feels like a soft thing, right?
right,
And I think the more that folks in HR can speak to the bottom line, speak to the numbers, speak to the cost of not doing it, right? The actual cost, and whether that's, if we don't invest in this initiative, we're gonna lose, you know, 20% of our workforce, making up numbers, 20% of our workforce. Huh. Okay. Well, even an entry level, we can calculate the actual costs that is, right?
right,
So we can if they're in a position where, like, we have the numbers, we measure these things, we measure retention, we measure turnover, we measure how long it takes to hire someone if we lose a key person, how long it takes to hire them, and the knowledge and relationship, cost that goes out the door with them. Some of that you can't measure, but most of it you can. And I think when you can speak the language of, what matters most to the CEO and or the executive team in terms of numbers and cost, right? Plus opportunity cost, plus actual cost, I
right.
think that you may have an ear,
Yeah.
right?
That's a really good point. And to actually help with that, it's funny you should mention this, and we did not prepare for this ahead of time, just full disclosure. I have been putting together a retention calculator that'll be on the Master Your Merger website, probably by the time this episode drops, where people can go in, they can put the size of their organization, the people in different tiers, and their salary information, or it can use averages from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it will tell you what your likely turnover during the first year of your integration is going to cost. So, and I did it for exactly the reasons you're talking about. It's so that when that HR person goes to have that leadership conversation, they can go informed with, hey, if this goes the way that it's predictable for attrition, this is the financial impact of that. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But thank you for the opening to share. I'm just excited about it because I think it's going to be a great tool to empower HR people.
Absolutely. Well, if I can add one more thought to that, which
Please.
you probably are going to cover in your tool, but what is the cost of empty positions, right?
Mm,
So the longer a position, there's a daily cost to the longer a position stays open. Oftentimes you hear leadership says, okay, we need to hire, okay, HR, you need to hire 5 people in sales, right? And then holidays come, or I don't know, we have a war, or don't call it a war. We call it something, right? And there's some global disruption or regional or industry, and then they're like, put the brakes on the hiring, and that
right.
just seems to be open ended, and you can calculate the daily cost. And if you don't have that calculation, let me know and I'll find it. But you can calculate the daily cost of an open position. Well, that's eye opening. So anytime you
Yeah.
can put a number to it, do.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one. I don't have that built into the calculator. It's just sort of attrition and replacement costs and what we've got out of the research. But why don't we look for that, Christina? We'll stick it in the
Yep,
show notes, and that way
happy to
HR
help.
folks listening or even our finance friends who listen in can find those numbers.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting really close to the end of our time together, and I've got just a couple more questions. So we'll do this as kind of a rapid fire round. So, Christina, what's the most important question a leader can ask in the 30 days after a deal closes? And what should they be listening for when they ask that question?
A leader in terms of, let's just say, a CEO or somebody in the HR leader.
Either one, whichever one you're feeling right now.
I think from an HR leader's perspective as well as the CEO, which is what is working?
Okay.
What is working well? We oftentimes want to look for problems, look for gaps, right? Look, and sometimes finger pointing happens, but not always, right? But kind of focus on these big gaps. But I think what is working now? How can we magnify it? It's easier to magnify a strength and to increase what's working and therefore the impact of what's working faster and with less effort than it is to close the gap. We
Mm,
might look at, say, 3 things that are working, and we can ask each manager, right? Or each employee for that matter. That's what I'd love to do. And then ask for, what's one thing that if we stopped doing, started doing, or did differently would make the biggest impact, right? Whether that's in your role or, organizationally. And it's interesting to get those answers and then aggregate that information. And I think that's just starting with the strength, starting with what's working in a positive way. Because, it's disruption creates lack of clarity, and lack of clarity, people make stuff up, like,
right.
as to why things are not working. And the most important thing also a leader can do is continue to be transparent and continue to communicate, be like beating a drum, right? And being transparent as much as possible. I think that also builds trust. It helps people get through the weeds when they feel things are getting really, really messy.
Well, I love that. And I think it's a great segue to my last question for you, which is the CEO is quite often the least leveraged person in the room during M&A. And I see all the time where a CEO getting acquired gets sidelined by the buyer and really not put to work the way that the CEO could be most effective. So what do you think, and what in your experience do CEOs really need to be doing or saying that nobody else can do during the deal?
The CEO, one, creates the culture, because if the CEO and leadership team don't create it and don't behave accordingly, everybody else, the employees will create it for you. And as a CEO or a leader, you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah.
So being very intentional about the conditions, right? They have to be visible, right? Walking the four corners, visible, talking to everybody, walking, like you say, walking the four corners, clear about priorities, and making sure they don't get diluted or don't shift quickly, right? Unless obviously it's can be helped, but make changing priorities on a whim is a terrible idea. So they have to, if they're silent or inconsistent, people are going to fill in the void or the vacuum with their own assumptions. And in a merger, it's assumptions are always anxious, and they're very, I don't know, navel gazing, like what's going to happen to me. And then people just really kind of get into their own silos. They stop sharing information, they stop collaborating, they stop taking risks. So the three things that CEOs need to do personally, naming what success looks like, right? And continue to name it, over communicate it, right? Over communicate it in all channels that you can think of. Model the behavior they expect to see from everybody,
Mhm.
right? From both teams, right? If we're talking about a merger, being transparent about what's being decided, whether it's a survey or whatever, that's come up, but being transparent about what's being decided and what is not going to be decided right now, especially when you ask people for information. Because a lot of times
Yeah.
people give you information or feedback. Hate the word feedback, it's kind of a four-letter word, feed forward. And people, I think, subconsciously expect you to then take that and do something with it. And then when they don't see something done with it, they don't feel hurt, right? So
Mm.
even if you just state, this is what I heard you say, great idea. That's something that we're unable to do right now, is it's not the focus, but perhaps we could put that on a someday maybe list and we can revisit that, right? So transparency creates trust faster than anything I can think of when it comes to leadership behavior during transitions.
Wonderful, wonderful advice. Well, Christina, thank you so much for our time together today. For listeners who want to learn more about you or your work, where should they go to find you or learn more about you?
Oh, absolutely. LinkedIn is a great place. It seems like I'm spending a lot of time in LinkedIn these days in terms of posts and articles and resources for people and for companies. So, Christina Haxton. My email address, which you might need to connect with me on LinkedIn, is Christina@sustainable-leaders.com. And my website is centerforsustainablestrategies.com. Sustainable, not as in green, well, maybe, but sustainable is in lasting.
Perfect, perfect. And we'll have links to all those in the show notes. So, again, Christina Haxton, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation.
Oh, thank you I appreciate your having me. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Clint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.